It's such a pleasure to be here. Just really, really pleased. Thank you for the invitation and for the chance to speak. And it's certainly a challenge to try to figure out how to explain American offset policy, biodiversity policy in 20 minutes. So I will do my best, and not to get into too many technical details, but let me start with a little bit of context about the nonprofit that I run. And we focus on speed. And partly it's just because I'm impatient, and just in the short conversations I've had with a number of you already, I can tell that you are too. I'm impatient. That's a weakness, a personal weakness, and I decided to make it into a strength and make that the focus of our organization's work. So how do we go faster? It means taking risk. What kind of risks can we take? What kind of risk can we tolerate in a world where climate change is driving so fast, and just moving slowly is basically losing. You're just losing more slowly. So we focus on speed. This is not related to biodiversity offsets, but one of our biggest programs is focused on lead pipes, lead water pipes, which are of course toxic. There are 10 million in America. There are even more in Europe and Canada, Japan, everywhere else in the world. There's no one who wants lead pipes to stay. So how do we replace them faster? That's an example of something we work on, and looking at the ways to use private finance, private business to quickly replace something that is very simple to do. Dig a hole or use other technology to take out an old pipe and put in a new pipe. This is the team of people that I work with, and looks like the face of the environmental or conservation movement in America, which is increasingly diverse, increasingly woman dominated. And so I'm an outlier on my team. And my background, as Tomas said, I worked in the Obama administration, where I covered for an office called the Council on Environmental Quality, which is a part of the White House, flood, wildfire, drought, wildlife trafficking, and innovative finance. And so this is a list of some of the policies that have been extremely important in America for offsets in the space of the Clean Water Act, in the context of our Endangered Species Act, or biodiversity policy. Those are some of the most important documents for the period of time that I was in the White House, which was 2015 to the beginning of 2017. Those are the kinds of actions that I was able to work on. So this is sort of an obscure statement of executive power in the United States, something called an executive action or executive order or presidential memorandum. But working to negotiate details that the president of the United States would say around offsets, around biodiversity and water and carbon offsets, was a first of its kind. There's never been a statement from a U.S. executive, at least, that talked about the standards that you need for effectively offsetting environmental impacts. Of course, all those things, as the list there shows, that President Obama did, President Trump rescinded. So it was a brief moment of success. But thankfully, many of those policies are now back in place again. And one of the most important things in the United States is how do we make those policies more durable so that they're not changed by repeated shifts in the political administration. So now I'm going to closer. Good. Is that better? Everybody's still good? Okay, sound. So these are the four real types of ecosystem service credit or outcome that we have in the United States. These all exist in essentially a regulated market. So where regulated offsets are a condition of federal policy or sometimes state policy. Wetlands are the biggest market, and I'll give some more examples of wetland offsets in a minute. But it's roughly a $3 to $4 billion annual market right now for the buying and selling of wetland restoration offsets. Those are private companies primarily going out and identifying a location that used to have a wetland on it and re-wetting, restoring the hydrology of that site, restoring the vegetation. And then for some other business that is impacting a wetland, providing that offset as a service. Very, very extensively regulated by the government in every region of the country, but a very large and growing market. A market that will be even bigger because there are more streams, more kilometers of streams and rivers in the United States than there are wetlands, is the same structure, but around stream and river restoration to offset damage from to streams. So every time a road crosses a river in the United States and someone expands the bridge over the road or over the water, that causes some amount of damage to that river, and that is a chunk of that is often offset. The damage from that is offset. Nutrient credits, so in the context of water quality, nitrogen and phosphorus or sediment loads put into streams and rivers and bays and ultimately the ocean, are also increasingly something that's regulated in the United States, although not anywhere near as clearly or consistently as streams and wetlands. And this is a growing market where governments, usually it's government and local government that faces regulation on this kind of water quality and impacts from runoffs from, for example, parking lots. And increasingly, those are another source of offset, where we get on sound. Still good? Okay. Where you can go out and fix a stream, fix a wetland for the purposes of selling to local government to offset the impacts they're causing to nitrogen, phosphorus, and water quality in general. And then endangered species are the last real big regulated market in the United States. And I should have said in the beginning, I'm really not going to talk about carbon because that's another 40 minutes. And because a lot of it is very similar to what's happening in Europe or where there's even more advanced approaches in the United States. But endangered species banks are the last space of this, where we have roughly 1,500 species, plants and animals, that are federally and nationally regulated. Harm to those species is regulated. And so you're either trying to avoid impacts to them, but if there are still impacts to their habitat or actions that kill individuals of those plants or animals, you have to do something like offset them with a bank, a species bank, someplace where the species have been restored. I'm not going to read the details of these, and happily anyone can have the slides after my talk. But there's sort of a set of approaches that we use in the United States that are maybe relevant here. Mostly what I've just described are advanced offset banks. So a business, or it could be a local government, goes out and entrepreneurially fixes something to meet a government standard. And then when someone else is damaging that same resource, they buy the offset. They're just transacting it. And I think you all know this space well. The other one is government procurement. I mentioned that in the context of nutrients a little bit, where government is increasingly, as opposed to doing the work itself, and this is where I think there are some language and cultural differences between the way our systems work and your systems work, but government can just outsource, just like government outsources buying laptop computers or pickup trucks. You can outsource buying the environmental goods that you need. And in the United States, this is the thing that I am most excited about, is government just simply saying, we need more birds, we need more water quality, we need more wetlands. Who has those things and can just give them to us? We don't care about the details. We don't need to plan it ourselves. Someone else can do that work with the biologists and the scientists they have. We'll just buy the outcome. We'll just buy the thing. Voluntary credits from ESG standards, again, something you all know well, are increasingly growing, but still a pretty tentative space in the United States. Voluntary carbon credits are going crazy in the United States, in a good way, crazy. And then the last system is really the oldest and one that we generally fight against, which is you're damaging the environment in some way. You just give money to the government agency and you get your permit. And in theory, the government agency goes and does good things with the money. But because the incentives are not set up in a way that ensures that the money gets spent well or quickly, or that if things are going wrong, there's a way to get them right. That's the system that we're least in favor of, and that we think of these others as all, alternatives to. So, wetland permits in the United States, just a few slides, a few examples of each of these things. Roughly I'll just round the number up, roughly 30,000, wetland impacts are regulated in the United States every year. The vast majority of those are less than a 5/100th, a 20th of a hectare in size, so trivial, right? You could see this footprint, right, of this tent. Very little offsetting for those kinds of things, but it still does take a permit. It's the other wedge that's more important. And before these policies came into place, that would have looked dramatically different. So because there's now a price for, there's a restriction on wetland destruction, and there's a price on what it pays to offset it, businesses now avoid those impacts wherever they can, and then just pay for the impacts when they have to. But the price is high enough that it dissuades a lot of destruction. I mentioned before the government pay a fee approaches. That's the yellow line you see here that's very low, or the permittee themselves, the company themselves trying to fix nature all on their own. And those approaches have fallen out of favor in the United States versus entrepreneurial third-party restoration businesses providing the services. So if you're a company that makes rotating metal things, as we were talking about before with Sam, why know how to do that, but also know how to fix a wetland? Why not let someone else who's really good at fixing wetlands or restoring biodiversity do those things? There are roughly 2,000 entrepreneurial offset banks across the United States. Only 5% of those are biodiversity banks, but that number is growing. And the policies that I mentioned in my first slide will likely lead it to grow more. Places like California, Texas, some of the biggest states in the United States, have the most banks, often have the most species, have the most protected resources. Florida, another big example. You see a lot of activity in states like that, less so in places like North and South Dakota. These are the kinds of prices we see for, in this case, these are all wetland credits. You might see credits, and this is in units of an acre, so cut that in half sort of for a hectare price. These prices are 6 years old, so they would all be 20, 30 to 50% more expensive today. For some species credits, you might see credit prices of $1 million, a hectare or half a hectare for offsets for endangered species. So this is how you get billions of dollars of activity transacting in the United States every year. Here's an example of a government delivered or government provided offset project. Salmon in California. California is very warm. If you've not been there, pictures of palm trees, right? Strange place for salmon. California still has salmon, pretty marginal. They also have smelt. That's a species called the Delta smelt. And because of the way California manages water, lots of water extracted for agriculture, for irrigated agriculture, from the habitats where these species are found, government has to offset its impacts on these species. Excuse me. And so that's an example. The site on the left there is an example of 3,000 or 1,200 hectares of farmland that for something like $180 million has been purchased by a private company and is being restored back to wetlands to provide to the state the offsets it needs for the impacts to these two species. So that kind of 1,000 hectare at a time, 2,000, 10,000 hectare at a time offset is happening with increasing frequency in the United States. I'm not going to explain a lot, but these are the examples of specific either habitat or species banks that have been created in the United States for all sorts of different species and ecosystems across the country. Lots of banks for those examples, fewer for these. And just a last couple of slides. The offset credits are complicated, and I think in terms of voluntary credits, such as some of the biodiversity ESG credits that are being developed now, you can look at the standards that are required for regulatory markets, like this one for endangered species, and simplify it, figure out how to simplify it to meet not a regulatory standard, but a standard that is good enough for businesses to transact upon. So these are examples from one wildlife bank, the kinds of standards that are required to meet a government approval for release of credits, for sale of credits in our markets. Just skipping to another example for a moment, that colorful region down low is the watershed of the Chesapeake Bay. It's the place where I live in the United States. And it's roughly a third of the area of Sweden, with I think about 40 million people. And there's 5 states in that region, and the colored areas are our version of counties, so much more local government than your counties. So one of the things that we've been working on in this particular region is looking at the innovative ways that private money is playing a big role in conservation. Because that estuary, the Chesapeake Bay, is the largest estuary in the United States, incredibly important for seafood production, recreation, you name it in the region. Water quality is really the big driver in that region, the quality of water in that bay, which is impaired. It is not beautiful blue water, it's brown, murky water because of all the runoff from farmland and everything else in the watershed. So this is a picture of the billions of dollars that have come from the private sector in the last 15 years that have gone into conservation. And these are some of the structures, and I think I can walk away from here. All the ones on the left-hand side for you are versions of transaction market-based approaches. So nutrient banking, wetland and stream banking, $500 million invested there, public and private partnerships where you have a government agency sign a deal or a contract with a company that says, you deliver those kinds of things for us, those environmental outcomes for us, and we'll pay you a fixed amount. So those are the public-private partnerships. And then a new category of work, pay for success contracts. That's the example I mentioned before, where you're trying to make environmental purchasing look a lot like laptop and truck purchasing. So those are just $170 million so far, but that's going to be a growing space of basically the way that government provides or produces the environmental outcomes that its taxpayers, our taxpayers, depend upon. And then, of course, forest land acquisition, certification, sustainability is a big thing here. So won't explain that, but that's also the biggest source of private financing in our region. And then tax benefits for conservation are an enormous activity in the United States that no one has really priced. But if you protect land in the United States, you get an enormous tax benefit from doing so. So it's a very widespread strategy in the United States. Associated with this kind of contracting, one of the things that a nonprofit like ours does is work on legislation. This is an example of a law, the first of its kind that just passed in the United States, called the Conservation Finance Act. And the law was designed with businesses, in partnership with businesses and the government, state government in this state, to attract $100 million of new private finance to conservation. So what would it take for $100 million, not of charitable or voluntary or donation-based private finance, but a profit-seeking finance that wanted to be paid back? What would it take to bring $100 million a year of new finance into the state? So we made 50 pages worth of legislative changes to state law for 5 different major environmental agencies, including the agriculture and the energy departments, that would make it possible for them to incentivize private business investment in nature. The biggest piece of that are those pay for success or outcomes contracts that I mentioned. So public agencies can now buy goods from the private sector, buy environmental goods from the private sector, but there are a host of other changes as well, including a new $20 million purchase program that's going to start next week, in fact. And it will be the first of its kind where the state government is just simply buying environmental outcomes using local government or state revenue to do so. I'm going to skip this slide, but that's detail on what a pay for success contract looks like. This is a definition that is now in state law, but we're increasingly trying to bring into federal law, which is a statutory definition of what an environmental outcome is, so that any government agency can say, there's an outcome, we want to buy it, what does it look like, how do you measure it, what are its parameters? And that concept of an environmental outcome is the same as a wetland restoration outcome, an endangered species outcome, or a carbon outcome. And this is my last slide, and I won't take the time to read this, but these are some of to me, the most important and part of the discussion I hope we get to have today. some of the most important lessons that come from at least the 20-ish years that I've spent looking at biodiversity offset, water, wetland offset markets in the United States. There are dozens and dozens of pilot projects launched every year. Many of those have really expensive monitoring and science components. Those expenses never go away, despite people's intent to try it this way at first and then figure out how we simplify it later on. That never works out, right? If you were to design a private product that was enormously unprofitable, you would have a really hard time ever making it profitable. So the monitoring and verification costs can sometimes be 50 to 100% of actually the cost of the activity, the restoration or the beneficial activity. That's almost always a loser. It never goes anywhere but as a pilot. Greenwashing, at least in the United States, is really an abusive term. And so we're trying to be distinct about when someone is actually intentionally labeling something positive that they know is not, versus when we make mistakes, right? When we don't have the science to tell us how to do it right. And that's the vast majority of what's happening in the offset space, voluntary crediting and offset spaces. Best we know, we have to act now. Let's use that and move forward. The key thing, at least in the United States, bullet number 4 there, is that our government agencies almost always think that what matters is price. They think you want a cheaper deal. And so they think that's what you're negotiating around. So time they can spend, in the United States at least, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years negotiating a permit, where they're saying you need to do this much or this much, and you're arguing back and forth on what they think is really price. But what businesses mostly rely on in the United or value in the United States is speed. So if you're trying to finance a $500 million wind facility, wind farm, and you've financed that, you can't wait 4 years for your permit. You would pay dramatically more to get your permit in a year. And that changing that dynamic so that government agencies understand how important it is to have a clear standard, and a standard that lets you get a permit fast is really one of the main things that we work on. So having higher but consistent and fast standards is generally more valuable. And then the last thing I'll point out there is that in the offset space, you say, okay, I showed this slide with 10 different ways you could measure biodiversity. That's great. So you pay for biodiversity. And someone says, well, what about the bike trail? We wanted a bike trail. If the government agency had been involved every step of the way instead of outsourcing it, we could have built in a bike trail. Like, well, you weren't going to pay for the bike trail. If you want a bike trail, just put the bike trail in your contract. When you put it out to bid, say we want more frogs and we want a bike trail, and price it. That's really important in America today because environmental justice is one of our biggest issues. Disadvantaged neighborhoods that have never received significant government money, and how do we get money to them? And so the shift is it should cost more to do that. That's actually valuing them more than saying, how do we get more frogs, but also do environmental justice work for the exact same price? What we should say is we want more equity, we want more environmental justice, and we want frogs in the same place. And each of those things has a price and a value. So how do we build basically multiple values into our contracting? So that's a really exciting space where we're basically advocating for more expensive projects because they're paying for multiple things at a time: carbon, environmental justice, and biodiversity and water outcomes. So thank you.